Welcome to the Everyday Musician Podcast. I am your host, Eric Mugala, and I have Aleksandr Karjaka on the line here. And normally with these episodes, I have questions or some kind of outline of what I'm going to say, but we're just going to freeball it. So, Alex, good to have you. And just tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Eric. It's a pleasure. And hello, podcast land. So my name is Alex Karjaka. I am a freelance clarinetist out here in New York. I have a music ed undergrad from Michigan State. I went to Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio for my first master's in clarinet, and then came out to the Manhattan School out here in New York to study for a second master's, and I never left. And I'm a freelance clarinetist. I sub with the Metropolitan Opera, the ballet over there, and at Carnegie Hall. I've toured the world with a variety of groups. I've played with Feist and some jazz legends and recording sessions and yada, yada, yada. Like, just a huge resume.
You do everything. You are definitely what an entrepreneur should be in the 21st century. Like, you do it all. Yeah, you're welcome. You're a musician. You're also, I would love to talk about your photography because that's like a big part of your life. Mm-hmm. And obviously you're in the scene. You're in the freelance professional music scene in New York. And what's that like? What's it like moving to New York? How long ago did you move to New York?
So this August 10th, I just celebrated 9 years out here, if you can believe it.
Wow.
I was just talking with my folks about it. It was like, it was a little rocky coming into New York. Basically, school started, I think, like 2 weeks later. And to give you a little backstory, like I was a sublet of a musician here in New York, and I think she had Airbnb'd it, or she'd rented out the room.
Yeah.
And when my family and we drove from Valparaiso, Indiana. We drove from Valpo all the way, 16 hours to New York. We got to New York, Sunnyside, and we got there around it was 10 to midnight. And Dolores, one of the landladies, in the building gate, I met her, I got the keys, and I went upstairs and to open the door, and there was a lock, there was a chain lock on the door, so I couldn't get in.
Oh.
And the people that were supposed to have moved out were still in the place. Yeah. And I just remember, and this is every New Yorker has some similar kind of story where it's just wait, you did what? So I went downstairs. My parents and my sister were in the van at the time, and I said, "There are people in the apartment still." And I just remember seeing the blood drain out of everyone's face, just kind of going, "Wait, we drove 16 hours, and there are people staying in the apartment."
And this is day one, right?
This was day one.
We
hadn't even got a full day.
You arrived, and then you just realized, okay, oh crap, gotta.
But you're running straight, you hit the ground running. So needless to say, my parents, my sister, and I spent the night in the apartment with some strangers in the bedroom, and then they because you couldn't get a hotel room. I mean, everything was booked. I mean, it was
no way. So you stayed in the hotel room with the strangers?
In the bedroom, in the apartment with the strangers.
That must have been insane.
Oh, it's bananas. It's we figured, I played it off as a good omen, it could only go up from here.
Okay, good.
And then from there, so what happened next was basically they eventually moved out that morning, and my parents, we went for bagels, we walked around. I tried to call my European parents, calm them down, and we had a wonderful time after that, but it was a little tumultuous that first 4 or 5 hours in New York. But I came out here, it was moving out here, the scene out here in New York was part of the reason why I wanted to go to Manhattan School. And nobody needs a second master's in clarinet. I'm just for all you listeners out there, unless you get the diploma, take private lessons.
Unless you're studying with a famous teacher, which I think was the case for you, right?
Yeah, I was studying with the legendary Michael Lowenstern, and The thing, like, I eventually, like, so I went to school at Manhattan. I actually withdrew my first semester. Luckily, I was able to audit a few more classes during the school year. But I just remember sitting, like, Mike's a wonderful teacher, is one of my mentors, and I just remember sitting down with Mike going, I'm paying $22,000 at the time. It was like, I think 18 or 19 to go, plus I took out a few bucks for loans and whatnot, like, to live.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike and I sat down for coffee. I think it was like late October, early November. And I was just like, if I just took lessons with you, or like, how do we make this work? Like, is it really worth, like, I was committed at the time to spending almost, $80,000 to go to school, like, for 4 semesters for a second master's. And it was like, the reason I came to study with Mike, to New York, was to study with Mike, but also I don't, like, the landscape has changed so much that, like, when you travel, like, so say you get married and your spouse gets a job in a new city, right? And you're both traveling musicians. Sometimes it's a little hard going in, like, to a cold new environment, putting up your shingle or your flag, on the ground and saying, hey, I'm here, bring on the gigs.
Right, and I think for a lot of the listeners listening who are non-musicians actually don't get to see that side of a musician's life, right? So for all you listeners who are non-musicians, this is, a common thing that us musicians have to deal with, right? And it's it is very difficult because when you kind of plant yourself in a new city, you don't know anybody, it can take many years to get yourself established, like what you did, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
With that's very good. Like, and the thing is, like, musicians were constantly getting, like, new jobs with different orchestras, or we're teaching, or there's an opportunity, but it's no different than any other kind of job where you're walking in for that first time. You don't know anybody, you don't know the politics, the hierarchy, the landscape. And so, like, whether you're working for a Fortune 500 company, or you're working for, like, the Met, or, like, the San Francisco, like, Opera or something like that, the LA Opera, it's like, you have your skill set, and then it's about networking. It's about, like, you're on for the next 2 to 3 years as you start to get comfortable.
Right, and I think it's important to note that not every musical job is a secure job, which is why musicians are under a lot of stress a lot of the time, because what we're doing, we're sacrificing a lot of our time and effort. Actually, I was speaking to another colleague who was telling me that being a musician actually is the most dangerous profession, because you have, of course, for people who are listening, I want people to be musicians. I mean, it's a beautiful career path, but you kind of have to know what you're getting yourself into. So the first thing is, musicians practice in a closed room for hours, and then you have to drive at least a minimum hour and a half to a gig. So there's a lot of risk involved to that. So either you're driving or you're on the subway, there's a lot of traveling involved. And then, not to mention, when you're first starting out as a professional musician, you may not get paid the big bucks. So you're under a lot of stress to make sure everything works.
Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Well, that's the thing. Like, so you move out, like, again, I grew up in Chicago and the Indiana, like, in the tri-state area, and then moving out to New York, it's like, you come to New York, there's no, even playing with these orchestras or smaller groups, like, there is no real, like, even though there, quote unquote, is security, there's still, like, people get fired. I mean, and when you're coming out here for the first time, like, you might start playing these gigs at, like, $100, like, a pop, or, like, even if you're playing, like, off Broadway, like, for $150, $200 a night, or if you're on Broadway and still getting maybe $250 to $300 a night, like, the thing is, it's like, you don't know, like, if you're a sub, like, you might get called one, like, first of all, becoming a sub in any of these groups is highly competitive, and the list is quite long, let alone, okay, you are on that list, and then getting the call, like, you might get called once a month, you might get called 3 or 4 times, but there's no real, like, there's no way to gauge, like, how much money, like, prospectively, that you'll make that month in order to meet your overhead, which, I mean, New York, like I'm out in Queens right now in a 1-bedroom at 18. Like I'm very lucky with paying $1,800 for this place after 9 years. But it's like if you're playing for $100 on a slice of pizza your first couple of years, like with as many groups as you can, that's a lot of gig performance time. But not to mention the rehearsals with these different groups, and then individual rehearsal time, because you want to go unprepared as much as you can, but meanwhile you're working like for me, I was lucky enough to work freelance with a music publisher here in town, but like some people get like they're working real jobs, or they're a barista or waiter,
they're working day jobs, right?
Mm-hmm. You got to balance it out, like not like unless you're like coming from family money or you've got a sponsor or something. Like I mean, musicians get backers from different instrument companies, that sort of deal. But for the most part, the rest of us, like, it's like Cortez in the New World. It's just like you burn your ships, and you're like, giddy up, let's do this. Like I'm here to stay. Yeah. But the thing, getting back to what you were talking about there's no real way to prepare for it. You just you get here and
you just dive in.
It's like being in a war zone. Like you're ready to go. Like you're mentally prepared as best as you can, and you just have to dive in, being like, all right, this is what I'm going to do today. And it's actions, these plans and whatnot.
I think being part of a musician is you have to be so incredibly disciplined. Like even outside of being a musician, you just have to understand yourself and make sure that like you are completely organized. And I'm actually very thankful for the listeners. They may not know this, but I actually had many jobs outside of music growing up. I had a marketing job, I had a sales job, and those have actually really helped me kind of push my brand and my image and how I perceive myself to others in the world. And I think that's also very important. And that's a good transition into branding, because Karjaka, you've lucked out on a great name. We've talked about this.
I did.
You've lucked out on a great name, and you use your name everywhere. So just for listeners who are not familiar with Alex's work, he is a commercial photographer. He does fashion photography, musician portraits, and he is just the overall entrepreneur. And I want you to speak a little bit about that, because what you do is really quite good, and you are hustling every single week. And I follow your blog and I follow your newsletter, and it's just amazing what you're doing. And you're doing this all by yourself with no help.
Yeah.
And just talk about that, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Well, I mean, that's a compliment coming from you. Thank you so much. Like you, growing up as a kid, like I had parents that were like, growing up with immigrant parents, the mentality was like, you'll have the rest of your life to work. Like, you don't have to race off and get a job immediately. And at 12, I started mowing lawns, and then I had a landscaping and small construction business for about 12 years. And all those tools and skills, just like with you, Eric, like they built into, okay, like how do I leverage all this with music? And so for me, like I was fortunate, like to grow up shooting film, like my father's film Nikon F camera, and like learning perspective. We'd watch movies. My mother and I would talk about life. Like my father and I would sit in the park and like observe squirrels and count and like learn how to like.
What a lovely day with mom.
Exactly, mom and dad. Like the beautiful thing about that, and especially with my sister too, is like we learned like how to frame life, how to observe people, how to interact, like all that stuff. That's like, if you're like the typical musician, for the most part, just they get their instrument, they fall in love with it, they get hooked, however, and then they spend 8 to 10 hours a day in practice. Like if you're a violinist or a string player, like it's when you start Suzuki, like at what, 4 or 5, you're
very young. Yeah.
And the same thing with piano. Like as a clarinetist, I started off at 10, but hadn't really committed till I was about 15. But the idea is this. So now I've got this Karjaka brand, right? I've performed around the world. I teach at Parsons at the School of Design at the New School. I'm able to, what I did with photography was basically, I needed okay, so here's the story. I've been out in New York 1 year, and I'm sitting on this couch in the same apartment in Sunnyside, like trying to figure out how to make, how am I going to make more money? Like as a clarinetist, as a brand, right?
In New York.
In New York.
Yeah.
So I sold my Honda Accord. I called up my folks. I'm like, sell the car.
Yeah.
And I'm going to dump that into photo gear. And they didn't hesitate. They're like, it was a lot of money at the time. And it was this beautiful 2007 Honda stick shift. And, and basically when the funding came through, basically I went out and I bought like a high-end Nikon and like zoom lens, and I seriously, and for all you listeners, like music or not out there, like especially the non-musicians, like I sat down on my couch, I Googled photographers in New York, and I emailed the first 20 people that came, like that in that Google feed, the majority all being wedding photographers, but still. And I emailed them all just saying, hey, like if you need an intern or an assistant, a second assistant, a third assistant for your company or your business or being on set, I'd love to come and interview and talk with you and like apply for a job that they weren't looking for, that
right.
sort of thing. And of the 20 people, as a small sample of the 20 people, I was sitting there and I got about, within a day or so, I got about 15 rejections. Well, 15 people never responded to me. I got 3 rejections. I got one woman called me up and said, how dare you email me? That was fun.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's surprising. Okay.
Yeah.
That's free work.
It was exactly, but I was also but at the time, it was free work, but I was also looking, I needed to get paid. So I was looking for minimum wage or I would have taken $15 an hour, at the time, or just something to get myself in the door.
Sure.
And this lovely woman, I'll hold off from saying her name, but she basically chastised me and then asked me how I would photograph on set. And I never heard back from her, but there were number 19 that responded back. Her name was Autumn Lynn, and Autumn basically said, look, this was a Tuesday. And she said, can you come in tomorrow, Wednesday, for an interview? I lost my assistant for the weekend for these weddings. If I like you, I'll pick you up for the 3 weddings and we'll go from there. We'll do a trial run. So, but again, as a musician, I had a music resume. I had a music resume and entrepreneurship resume and no real photo accolades at the time. And this was 9 years ago. And the interview went stellar. She looked at my resume and she was just like, what were you planning on doing with this? And that was the start of me shooting weddings out here, which that was a nice 2 to 3 year chunk of my life as I built up enough to start saying, okay, what do I really want to do? Do I want to shoot weddings? And this is with any business, it's you start making some nice cash, but it's what's the bigger picture? And that going back to entrepreneurship. So you look at I wanted Karjaka to be I'm building Karjaka to be this international brand where it talks about music, about art, about branding and marketing, regardless of what field, and engagement, social engagement, all encompassing. And basically it had, for me, I was able to leverage Facebook, for example, Facebook and Instagram, especially marketing. I would, just like I do today, if you follow me at Karjaka, at Karjaka, on Instagram, that's how I'm able to leverage the majority of my work comes out of Instagram and Facebook, where I was able to take all these musicians. You figure at the time, I was networking here in New York. I was building my audience. I think I have 4,000 followers on Instagram and about almost 3,000 on Facebook, or something like that. And I was basically it's free marketing. Like all the social media platforms, Google, like LinkedIn, all, like if you're into building like little things like Etsy, all that stuff where you're putting up new photos and just that constant stream of content where it's like it's quality content has a specific message, right?
Sure, yeah. But you also bring up very interesting points about social media because it's free organic followers that you can gain, right? And social media, it's never gonna die. It's here to stay.
No,
And
it's
you do
no.
Instagram. You're really frequent. You're a frequent poster on Instagram. Like you do a lot of the stories. You do a lot of the posting. Like you're definitely trying to. You're doing what you preach, essentially.
You have to, especially like, I don't know if you remember this, but it was even about a year ago, people were complaining about the Instagram stories, the Insta stories, like, oh, we're going to go more back, we're going to start doing more video, we're going to stop, like, we're going to start taking away from the photo aspect. And I think, like, if you look a year later, like now, it's like, I'm actually, like, I'm getting more return or, like, conversion based on the Insta story. Like if you look at your Facebook feed, for example, like you can't scroll a second without a video popping up, or like I've got like all the cat, I just will zone out on set every so often to like a cat video because Facebook. And
cats are taking over the world on the internet. It's just like, what can you do?
You want that dopamine hit. You want it to feel good.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's like, oh, something cute and cuddly. You feel physically, you have the chemical response.
Yeah.
But it's like, going back to the Insta story, it's like, now it's like, this morning, I was looking at my post from yesterday that just ended a few minutes ago. And it's like, that post had almost 300 views on it. Like, just on the first image, like, and it was just talking about like what, like I call BS on Mondays being like the worst day of the week. Like we can make creative days any day, but like a little inspiring message, a beautiful photograph. But the idea is that you're constantly organically leveraging a free, like you can put money into posts and whatnot. I have friends that dump thousands every week, but they can't tell me what the conversion rate is to their business. And my whole thing is I will invest money and time. Like I have retouchers and printers and I have assistants and like my whole team when I'm on set. But when it comes to like social media and building an infrastructure, I have my inner circle that I talk to, but I have to be the one to execute it.
Right. And you, just speaking in business terms, you need to search the return on investment on everything.
Mm-hmm. Everything's all about the ROI. Like if look, I'm like with the algorithm, like Gary Vaynerchuk put this out the other day. It's like the algorithm on Instagram changes so much that it really isn't an algorithm anymore, because the algorithm, we assume that with an algorithm, it's going to stay the same. But because it changes so much, if you forget the algorithm altogether and focus on putting out quality imagery and or quality content, whatever that is, whether you're into boats or you're into like podcasts or you're into flowers or whatever, by putting out quality content organically, putting out consistently with a message, like the big thing is that like you could look at if you look at my photos right now, the likes aren't doing very well as a return on investment, but I still know as a business, people are still scrolling through, they're still opening, I'm looking on my MailChimp for my newsletter and my blog posts and all of it. It's you can't, with the mistake that we make and a lot of businesses make and individuals, music or not, make is that I did all this stuff on Instagram, but I'm not seeing the return. I'm not seeing the conversion. And it's a multi-front war. It's multi-platform. It's okay, so you're doing you have to double down across the board, whether it's Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter. I don't really use Twitter a ton. And that's something for me in my development, I need to spend more time developing.
Yeah, I think I've been spending a little bit more time on Twitter just because I can just share what's on my mind and it's quick. I don't have to think about a picture. I don't think about maybe posting a video. Although you start seeing little glimpses of that on Twitter where video is definitely trying to take over my newsfeed. Yeah. So yeah, this is great advice for musicians and non-musicians and, especially people who are interested in business.
But the beautiful thing is, like, I'm able to, like, I leverage a lot of this with my students at Parsons. Like, they're these young students going into fashion, they're going into photography, they're going into design. Like, the principles stay pretty consistent regardless of what career path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Alex, you're like a perfect example of what this podcast is all about, because you're doing all this amazing work in your business, but you're just like an everyday guy. You're just like an everyday person. Like we had Korean barbecue just not too long ago in Queens. And, you're just like so easy to have a conversation with. And I just encourage everybody who is in the market for a photographer or just like really interested in, because I got my headshots done by you, and that's how we met recently, earlier this summer. Summer of 2019. Yeah. And I'm so glad that we met. I'm glad that we met under really funny circumstances. Yeah. And but you just do incredible work for photography. And if people are interested in what he does, Karjaka.com, and I'll put that in the podcast description notes. And you could also, my face is plastered on Google and my and my Facebook and Instagram, so that black and white shot was done by you.
Yeah.
And it was done by you, and it was just an incredible shot and really easy to work with. But let's touch base about what your process is when you're taking a photograph, because you specifically said you take portraits. You don't take headshots. You take portraits of musicians. So describe that for me, for the audience as well.
Well, for me, headshot is like a 4-letter word. It's like, I don't like a so I studied classically, like Renaissance art, like studying the history of, great artists in light. And so the idea was like, when Rembrandt painted, it was never a headshot. It was a portrait. When Vermeer made these masterworks, they weren't headshots. They weren't scenes. I mean, they were scenes and they were headshots, but they were portraits of what was going on in the times of the person. So a headshot for me really sounds very sterile. It says we're not building a relationship here. It's in and out. We got 10 minutes. Granted, you can take a portrait in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 1 minute. Doesn't really matter the time. It's more about connecting with your client. And that's with a portrait, regardless of the amount of time that I have, it's more, I'm genuinely interested in what and who that person is, who they are in the world, what they're doing, why they're here with me. Every photographer will tell you they're a storyteller, and it's gotten into that whole kind of cliche bit. And for me, I don't yes, I am a storyteller, but the camera is a vehicle for me to get to know who you are and who more people in the world. And yes, I do get to tell their story, but the headshot just says we need usage of this image. This image is going to have a very specific focus and message, and we're going to plaster this onto a website or whatever conference we're going to or seminar that we're headlining. But a portrait says my mission in a portrait is to have your audience be drawn in to ask what's going on over there, what's happening, who is that person. And so I get so tired of seeing the same sort. You see a lot of these actor headshots. You see a lot of musician portraits, or these. Even I still shoot law portraits and whatnot. And you see a lot of people just the same poses, smile, expression, lighting, and background. And I was saying at that festival that we were at for Fresh Ink with Fifth House, your audience goes kind of what we call nose deaf, but you just do it. You go blind. You stop seeing the person. You just see the consistency between all the imagery, and nothing's really that memorable. And at the end of the day, my whole thing is I don't care how many, we can take 10 photographs, we can take 200 photographs. I really don't shoot more than that. Mm-hmm. And in studio or on the street. And at the end of the day, it's I'm looking for my one photograph, the one photograph that puts you in poses you in the best light, best expression, and that grabs you authentically.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah. So what you said was very similar to what we do as musicians. We try to connect with our audience. We use our instrument as a vehicle or as a tool to really connect with our audience. And it goes to show that that's what we were doing 300 years ago, and that's what we're doing today. And I think we have this ongoing conversation, which I've talked about on the podcast with many of the composers and musicians that I've had the pleasure of speaking with, that, people say that classical music is dying, right? That music is the same. We're using the same kind of formula to write the music. It's not as original anymore. But I think that there really is an opportunity for classical music to really shine and grow within the next decade. And I know that you see that. I know I see that. I've talked to people that really, really see this and believe in this. And I just want you to share your thoughts with the audience who's listening in today about classical music and the state of classical music. What do you think is the state of classical music today?
I'm comparatively to a lot of people that we've talked to, I'm actually still very excited about it. Here's what gets me. It's like, we use despite you look at despite all the negativity that people put out about classical music, enrollment at schools, conservatories, music schools couldn't be higher. Yes, there's a lot more competition, but there's also a lot more opportunity for people to hear your work, to be a part of that. To go back to photography. Photography's been around. The first photograph was taken in 1838, daguerreotype back out in France. And so, we're coming up on just shy of 200 years of photography. And you look at Instagram, and you could look at it the same way as classical music. Why would I take another photograph, in a sea of photographs? Or why would I compete? The same thing with music. It's in a sea of, personally as a clarinetist, in a sea of clarinetists or bass clarinetists, why would I go out there? And it's not so much, it's something that, I don't think classical music is dying. I think it's evolving, just as we are evolving. You've got, for example, you've got more access. Think about it. People, I keep saying think about it. You've got all these musicians, or you've got all these entrepreneurs posting on all these different social media platforms that 20 years ago, 20, 30 years ago, all you had was the newspaper, magazines, events. Now you have it all at your fingertips. What we're missing out on is a way in which connecting to our audience that we're a very visual society, right? And our need as musicians is to elevate or connect in a way that engages our audience no different than that visual aspect. So whether it be SoundCloud or iTunes, I believe that music alone can stand very well, but paired with multiple platforms, I think the future of music, look at all these different action movies, with comic books like Marvel and all that. And you have
especially Marvel.
Marvel. You got Michael Giacchino writing all these scores. You've got Hans Zimmer. The classic, John Williams. We start seeing you start looking at movie music as it's is it as its own genre possibly, or is it a ripoff? Or is it not? We could have this philosophical debate about where it is.
Yeah, that's an entirely different podcast episode right there. But I think you're gonna bring up a couple other interesting points that I think in addition to movie scores and cinematic music, I think that video game music is also on the rise. And you're starting to see a lot of composers composing for video games because, you have there's a recent tournament for Fortnite, right? So this is becoming their sport, and then people are of course are following that trend. And
well, you think about it. You have people going to school getting degrees to write for video games. Even a decade when I was back going through my first master's, it wasn't even considered something that you do. And to be honest, that's part of where your market is now. It's even if those composers then wrote a symphony or chamber music or new music or whatever, it's a gateway. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, whatever we can do as musicians to connect with an audience. you know,
Exactly.
just like any kind of audience, because we're here to serve the public in many ways, right? Like we do music because we enjoy it, because it's our calling, but at the end of the day, we're trying to send some kind of a message to an audience to inspire them, or for them to learn a new message of some sort, right?
Well, that's what we had that with cartoons. I mean, think of Bugs Bunny, right? Like, and all the, like, we had Rossini, you know, like you had all that classic opera at the time, like, and that's how audiences learned about opera and classical music at like a young age on Saturday afternoon, Saturday morning cartoons.
That's right.
And,
yeah.
And now you got it, and I mean, now you're connecting with like movies or like video games and all. I mean, I don't think, like, I think it's a real travesty if we really think that classical music is dying. I think it's evolving.
Evolving. I like the word evolve, because it's I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before for the listeners who've been listening for the past 30 or so episodes, that in the beginning of each century, we start to see a shift in the mentality of the public, of the society, and what the society values. And then, of course, musicians will cater to writing music for that kind of society. So, you know, like 1820s, you start seeing the rise of Schumann and Brahms. And then, you know, 1720s, you start seeing the rise of Mozart, and then Haydn. And Haydn's already been around, right? But you start seeing these major changes in music towards the second decade of each century that will actually help influence the rest of the century, if you look back at music history. And I say
look at the last 50 years. Like, look at, like, you know, Steve Reich or Philip Glass. I mean, like, we've all seen that kind of, I mean, and that in our short lifespan, you know, from the 60s on, like, see that influence now. We see, you know, Marilyn Nankin. We see, oh man, like, we see all those Bing on a Can guys. We see, I mean, all that sets us up for the future. But it would be such a, like, again, it comes back to that message. It becomes back like, what's the impact on the world?
Exactly. And people who are not musicians need to realize that there was never like a musician that declares, okay, I declare that this day is the start of the Romantic period, right? Or I declare that this day is the start of minimalism, right?
Yeah.
So the way that music history works, which is like kind of like all history, which they kind of blend the lines, right?
Yeah.
You know, 20th century music didn't start until Debussy in the early 1890s, as a matter with the Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, right?
Yeah.
So that was 1890. So that's actually set the trajectory of 20th century music, and it even started before the 20th century. So that it kind of blurs the lines, and I think we're starting to see that a little bit with video game music and cinematic score writing with music.
Well, even look, like, you get neo-romanticism. You get this like a need to take the past and make it a little bit more modern, and like you look at Rachmaninoff or Prokofiev, for example, like,
or even Stravinsky.
Exactly.
Stravinsky is a very famous example of neoclassicism.
Neoclassicism, neo-romanticism, the idea that, like, we don't, like, the way we compose and perform today. I mean, like, we might see a neo event happening in the precipice, or we might see more. But it's hard. Like, when you get questions like, do you think classical music is dead? We've probably been asking the same question since the start of minimalism, you know, or if not earlier, like with Berg and Schoenberg and all that. It's like,
but you know, Alex, I think people are really starting to ask that, especially in the U.S., because you start to see a lot of orchestras folding, and you see a lot of strikes because players are fighting for their pensions, and which for good reason, right? They're the top 1% of players in the country, so they have the right to, you know, get paid the way they get paid, and because they play at such a high level, just incredibly high level, and you know, I think it kind of, you know, for the people who are like in their teenage years, who are kind of debating whether or not to have a career in music because they're starting to see all these strikes happening, right, with the orchestras.
Right.
But I think our advice for the people listening in is that you don't necessarily have to be an orchestral player. You don't have to necessarily have a traditional root in music. I mean, look at Alex and I. We're not We're not, I mean, we play in orchestras, but are we full time? No, because I think it's part of the variety that we enjoy. We like the variety.
Absolutely.
We like having different options on the table because then it just gets boring.
Well, it's having a well-rounded life. I mean, not to get too philosophical, but having like a career that spans more than just like, I mean, Eric, I'm sure you can agree with this. It's like we've played with all the groups that we've played with, like half the groups I've played with, like the musicians are miserable, especially the ones that have been there the longest. Like,
yeah,
kind of burnt out, like going through the motions. A friend of mine just left the Columbus Symphony. We were just over drinks the other day talking about like you can kind of see your future as you're sitting in these spots, you know, like looking at the like the quote unquote old timers just burn out playing Brahms for the 400th time. But meanwhile, people like you and I, for example, having that like we taste a lot of things and like have that well-roundedness to be able to go, I'm going to play Baruch again and I'm going to enjoy it because it's not a job. It's like it's one in the arsenal of what we do.
Yeah, I really agree. And I think music, playing in an orchestra, gives one that opportunity to look at yourself and like, because there's a big age range. Like you can be 21 and, play in an orchestra, but you could also be sitting next to a stand partner who's like in his or her 50s or 60s, right? And normally with orchestra jobs, they've worked so hard to get them that they never leave their position. Yeah, so it's
a job.
It's a job. It's, if you think about it, it's a 9-to-5 job with extra hours in the evening because you sit at a desk with someone you may or may not like, and
you saw away.
And you saw away. But I think what makes an orchestra really unique, I think that's a result of poor leadership. I think that's a result of poor administration, and I mean, look at Baltimore Symphony right now. I think they have good leadership, and the players are high caliber, definitely top 1%.
Absolutely.
But and I still find the value in orchestra. However, I think it's administrations across the country who may come across this podcast and be like, okay, you got to step up. Like if you want to grab a bigger audience or to have a more diverse audience. I mean, look at what Philadelphia Orchestra is doing. You have this new music director who's been around for 3 or 4 years, now director of the Met Opera, who just invited how many female composers? 6 to 9 female composers. So like that's the kind of change that the country needs, and that's what society is wanting, essentially.
Absolutely. Well, they want something that's out of the box, that goes beyond what they already know. And I really feel for both sides of the coin, the musicians and the administration, in the sense that the administration, like, their whole thing is they got to get butts in the seats. Like, if there's nobody in that audience for them, there's no way to pay the musicians, whether it's Baltimore, the Met, or anywhere else.
Yeah, and I think, and particularly that's also another reason why this podcast exists, is so that way you and I can educate these people that, like, look, classical music has been more alive more than ever, and go to kind of shut down the Netflix for a night and go see a concert. I'm dead serious. Go to see a concert because the music like this can really change your life. It really helps you think differently, and it's support your local musicians, your local orchestras, and these people who are on that stage have given their lives to provide a service for all of you. And it really is, that's what we do. We try to change lives through music, and it may sound cliche, but at the end of the day, we kind of need that.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more.
All right. Well, look, Alex, it's been such a pleasure. Pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and I hope to have you on the podcast again, which I'm sure
I'd love
we
to
will.
come back. This is
I'm sure
great.
we will. And do you have any last thoughts for people who are listening, and anything that you can try telling, like the non-musician listening, that would like to attend a concert but they kind of don't know how to start, they don't know where to look, like what kind of advice do you have to give them?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I tell this all the time. Like, to be honest, I do this even as like as we're musicians, like I still don't know a ton. Like I know a fraction of what's out there because we just don't have the time. Like to be honest, I scroll through Pandora, like when I'm on the subway train or when I'm like out there or like doing an activity or a job where where I can zone out and just listen to music and like I've never heard this piece, let's hear this. Or like you go on YouTube. My advice would be like just 20 minutes to go go down the rabbit hole like and really explore. Like we have more access to music and like composers and musicians more so than ever before. So it's just a matter of like you can get a taste of what you're like. You can go to the concert hall. You can like buy a subscription. That's all really great. I mean, you can stop by the box office and ask who are your favorites. Like I used to do that all the time. But to be honest, like you got it all at your fingertips. Like listening to YouTube, like and Pandora or Spotify or Bandcamp, like all that's really great. Like to get like a taste, but don't like the second part of that is don't forget to hear it live. Because it's an experience, like hearing an orchestra, like through your headphones or through a speaker system in your car. That's really nice, but it pales in comparison to the catharsis that is when you hear when you hear Nina Young live or something like that.
And also, in addition to that, don't be intimidated to dress nicely. Like dress in the clothes that you want to dress in. And, classical music's for everybody. It's not for.
It's not for the elite.
It's not for the elite, right? Like, people, if people judge you, that's on them. It's not on you for you trying to enjoy. So just want to make that very clear that that you go there for the music, not for the prestige of going.
The prestige, exactly.
Right. I think that's very important because people may think that, and it's totally not the case.
No, it's not. You can go for the show, but it's like the walk, the parade that is to your seat. But at the end of the day, it's what moves you in your seat that really changes your life.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alex Karjaka and Karjaka Studios. Follow his website, follow his blog, his brand, karjaka.com. And I will also put that in the podcast description notes. And if you have any questions for Alex, questions, if you have any specific questions for Alex, please leave them in the comments on your choice of podcast platform, either on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, wherever you find it. Just spill away. And then maybe we can answer questions in the future podcast episode.
I love that.
All right. Well, Alex, thanks again for taking the time. And
Eric,
we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Talk to you soon, buddy.
Talk to you soon, bud. Bye.